Hello, how are you today? And are you ready to hear mysteries? If you're ready, I'll tell you.
New Road. Samantha and Michael were adventurers at heart. The couple had a passion for exploring off the beaten path locations, often seeking out places with a reputation for being haunted. Their latest trip was no exception. They had planned a road trip to visit an abandoned village in the remote mountains of West Virginia, rumored to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. The day started off bright and sunny as they set off in their trusty SUV, the trunk packed with supplies for a week-long adventure. As they drove, they chatted excitedly about the stories they had read about the village. Ghostly apparitions, strange sounds, and mysterious lights were just some of the phenomena reported by previous visitors. "We're finally doing it," Michael said, grinning as he navigated the winding mountain roads. "I've been looking forward to this trip for months." Samantha nodded, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Me too. I can't wait to see if the stories are true. Imagine the footage we could capture." Their enthusiasm was palpable as they made their way deeper into the mountains. The scenery was breathtaking, with dense forests, steep cliffs, and winding rivers. However, as the sun began to set, the atmosphere grew more ominous. The once beautiful landscape took on a darker, more foreboding tone. Nightfall found them on a narrow, twisting road that seemed to lead nowhere. The GPS had long lost signal, and there were no signs of civilization in sight. Michael squinted at the map, trying to figure out if they had taken a wrong turn. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Samantha asked, a hint of doubt creeping into her voice. Michael shrugged. "I think so. The map shows the village is just a few miles ahead. We should be there soon." Suddenly, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Michael slammed on the brakes, and the SUV screeched to a halt. The couple stared in shock at the figure, a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face pale and expressionless. Samantha grabbed a camera from the back seat and started filming. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. The woman slowly raised her hand and pointed down the road. Then, as abruptly as she had appeared, she vanished into thin air. "Did you get that on camera?" Michael asked, his voice shaky. Samantha nodded. "I think so." "What do you think she was pointing at?" Michael hesitated before answering. "I guess there's only one way to find out." They continued down the road, their nerves on edge. The atmosphere grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring their vision. After what felt like an eternity, they saw the faint outline of buildings through the mist. "We're here," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. The village was exactly as described in the stories, abandoned, eerie, and shrouded in an unsettling silence. The buildings were in various states of decay, with broken windows and overgrown vegetation. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. Samantha and Michael parked the car and stepped out, their breath visible in the chilly air. They began to explore, filming everything they saw. Strange sounds echoed around them, whispers, footsteps, and distant laughter. Shadows moved at the edge of their vision, always disappearing when they turned to look. As they ventured deeper into the village, they felt a growing sense of dread. The paranormal activity intensified, with objects moving on their own and ghostly figures appearing and disappearing. Despite their fear, they were determined to document everything. Their exploration led them to the village church, a crumbling structure that seemed to be the epicenter of the activity. Inside, the air was even colder, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and they were plunged into darkness. Samantha fumbled with the camera, trying to switch on the night vision. When she succeeded, they saw the ghostly figure of the woman from the road standing at the altar. She began to speak in a language they couldn't understand, her voice echoing unnaturally. The walls of the church seemed to close in, and the temperature dropped further. "We need to get out of here," Michael said, grabbing Samantha's hand. They ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The woman's chanting grew louder, and the ghostly figures of villagers appeared around them, their eyes filled with sorrow and anger. In a desperate bid, Michael kicked the door open, and they fled into the night. They didn't stop running until they were back in the car, their hearts pounding and breath ragged. Michael started the engine, and they sped away from the village, not daring to look back. The road seemed longer and more treacherous than before, but they were determined to put as much distance between them and the haunted village as possible. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a main road and the safety of civilization. They pulled into a motel, too exhausted and shaken to continue driving. In their room, they reviewed the footage they had captured. It was undeniable proof of the paranormal, filled with ghostly apparitions and inexplicable phenomena. They knew they had to share their experience, but they also knew this was just the beginning. Back home, they uploaded their footage and began to share their story with the world. The response was overwhelming, with many people fascinated by their encounter. Paranormal investigators and enthusiasts reached out to them, eager to learn more. Samantha and Michael realized that their passion for the supernatural had led them to something extraordinary. They decided to continue their adventures, seeking out other haunted locations and documenting their experiences. Their journey into the unknown had just begun, and they knew that there were many more mysteries to uncover. Each new adventure would bring them closer to understanding the world of the paranormal, and they couldn't wait to see where the road would take them next.
The Ghostly Hitchhiker. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind that sends shivers down your spine. Jane and Michael were returning home after visiting Jane's parents in a distant town. The journey had been long, and as the storm grew fiercer, they decided to take a shortcut through a lesser-known route called Hollow Creek Road. Hollow Creek Road was infamous among the locals. Legends spoke of ghostly apparitions and unexplained disappearances. The road wound through dense forests and desolate stretches, with barely any signs of civilization. Jane was uneasy about taking the road, but Michael assured her it was just a myth. As they drove deeper into the woods, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the twisted branches of the trees, casting eerie shadows on the road. The radio began to malfunction, switching stations erratically before going silent altogether. They had no cell service, leaving them completely isolated. Through the rain, they saw a figure standing by the roadside, drenched and shivering. Jane insisted they stop to help. The figure was a young woman in an old-fashioned dress, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, can you give me a ride to the nearest town? My car broke down," she pleaded. They hesitated but eventually agreed. The woman climbed into the back seat, her presence immediately filling the car with an unnerving chill. She introduced herself as Anna and remained silent for most of the drive, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. As they drove, strange things began to happen. The temperature inside the car dropped dramatically, and the windows fogged up. Jane glanced back at Anna several times, but each time she seemed to be fading, her form becoming translucent. When Jane asked Anna where she was headed, she replied with a cold, emotionless voice, "Home. I need to get home." Following Anna's directions, they arrived at a decrepit, abandoned house deep in the woods. The house looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. Jane and Michael exchanged worried glances but decided to help Anna inside. The interior was covered in dust and cobwebs. The furniture was old and decayed. Anna led them to a room where she pointed to an old photograph on the wall. It was a picture of a family, and there she was, standing with her parents. "That's me," Anna said softly. "I died in a car accident near here many years ago. I've been waiting for someone to help me find peace." Suddenly, the room grew colder, and they heard whispers echoing through the halls. The whispers grew louder, turning into anguished cries. Jane and Michael realized they were surrounded by spirits of those who had perished on Hollow Creek Road. Desperate to escape, they turned to Anna, but she had vanished. The spirits began to close in on them, their ghostly forms reaching out with skeletal hands. Jane and Michael ran out of the house, their hearts pounding in terror. They jumped into their car and sped away, the cries of the spirits fading behind them. As they reached the main road, they felt a sudden warmth, as if they had passed through an invisible barrier. The next day, they visited the local library to research Hollow Creek Road. They found old newspaper clippings about a young woman named Anna who had died in a car accident on that road decades ago. Her spirit was said to haunt the area, searching for someone to help her find peace. Jane and Michael never took Hollow Creek Road again. They often spoke of their encounter with Anna, wondering if they had helped her spirit find the peace she sought. The experience left them deeply shaken, a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. To this day, they can't forget the ghostly hitchhiker they encountered on that stormy night, and they always advise others to avoid the haunted Hollow Creek Road.
The haunting delivery. John Miller, a seasoned truck driver, was used to long hauls and lonely roads. One evening, he received a job that took him to a remote part of the American countryside, a route he had never traveled before. The job was straightforward: deliver a shipment of goods to a small town nestled deep in the woods. As John drove along the winding road, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The further he went, the more isolated he felt. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just the dim glow of his headlights cutting through the darkness. John had been warned about this route. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences and eerie encounters. The most famous of these tales was about a ghostly figure that roamed the road, hitchhiking, only to vanish into thin air once inside a vehicle. The locals advised truckers to never pick up hitchhikers in this area. Ignoring the uneasy feeling gnawing at his gut, John pressed on. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rumble of his engine. Suddenly, in the distance, he saw a figure standing by the side of the road, partially illuminated by his headlights. As John got closer, he could see it was a woman in a long, white dress, her face obscured by her hair. She stood motionless, arm outstretched, thumb pointed up. Remembering the warnings, John felt a chill run down his spine. He drove past her without stopping, but when he glanced in his rearview mirror, she was gone. The encounter left him rattled, but he tried to shake it off. A few miles down the road, his truck's engine began to sputter, and the vehicle slowed to a stop. Cursing under his breath, John stepped out to check the engine. The night was unnaturally quiet, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. Heart pounding, he quickly got back into his truck and locked the doors. As he turned the key, the engine roared back to life, and he sped off, eager to leave the eerie stretch of road behind. But the nightmare was far from over. In his rearview mirror, he saw the woman again, this time closer. She was standing in the middle of the road, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. John could see her clearly now, her pale face twisted in a grotesque expression of anger and sorrow. Panic set in as she started to move toward the truck. John floored the accelerator, but the truck seemed to be moving in slow motion. The woman was now directly behind the vehicle, her ghostly form keeping pace with the speeding truck. She raised a hand, and the truck shuddered violently as if hit by an unseen force. John's fear turned to sheer terror when he realized the woman was now in the passenger seat. Her icy hand reached out to touch him, and he felt a searing pain as her fingers brushed his arm. He swerved, trying to shake her off, but she remained, her touch burning like fire. In a desperate attempt to escape, John veered off the road, crashing into the trees. The impact knocked him unconscious. When he came to, he was surrounded by paramedics and police officers. They told him they had received a distress call from his truck's GPS and had come to investigate. John tried to explain what had happened, but his story was met with skepticism. There were no signs of anyone else at the scene, and the truck was undamaged, despite John's insistence that he had crashed. As he was taken to the hospital, John heard the locals whispering about the ghostly hitchhiker. They spoke of a woman who had died in a car accident on that very road, years ago. Her spirit was said to haunt the area, seeking vengeance on those who ignored her pleas for help. John never drove that route again. The memory of that night haunted him for the rest of his life, a chilling reminder of the ghostly figure that had terrorized him on the lonely, dark road.
The haunting drive home. It was late October, and the chill in the air was a stark reminder that winter was fast approaching. Sarah and Mark were returning from a weekend getaway in the mountains, their car packed with camping gear and memories of the serene landscape. Little did they know, the journey home would be anything but peaceful. As the sun began to set, the couple found themselves on a desolate stretch of road winding through dense, dark woods. The GPS indicated a shortcut, a narrow road called Old Willow Lane, which promised to shave an hour off their travel time. Against their better judgment, they decided to take it. The road was rough and poorly lit, the overhanging trees creating eerie shadows that danced in the headlights. The atmosphere inside the car grew tense as they realized they hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. The radio began to crackle, then switched off entirely, leaving an unsettling silence. A few miles down Old Willow Lane, they saw a woman standing on the side of the road, her white dress fluttering in the breeze. She appeared to be in distress. Mark slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" Sarah asked. The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, can you take me to the nearest town? My car broke down." They hesitated but ultimately decided to help. The woman climbed into the back seat, her presence immediately sending a chill through the car. She introduced herself as Emily and remained silent for most of the drive, only occasionally giving directions in a soft, trembling voice. After about 20 minutes, Sarah turned to ask Emily a question, but she was gone. The back seat was empty. Mark stopped the car, and they both got out, searching the area with their flashlights, but there was no sign of her. Shaken, they decided to continue driving, eager to leave the eerie road behind. Their relief was short-lived as they soon came upon an old, abandoned house. The GPS directed them through the property as if it were a shortcut. Desperate to get back to a main road, they decided to explore, hoping to find someone who could help or at least give them directions. The house was in disrepair, its windows shattered, and the door creaked ominously as they pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under their weight. They split up to search for any clues or signs of recent habitation. In one of the rooms, Sarah found a diary on a dusty table. It belonged to Emily, the woman they had picked up. The entries detailed her life in the house and her tragic death in a car accident on Old Willow Lane. The last entry was particularly chilling. "I must warn travelers to stay away from this cursed road." As Sarah read the diary, Mark called out from the other room. He had found a photo of Emily with her family, confirming she was indeed the same woman. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and they could see their breath in the air. Whispers filled the house, growing louder and more frantic. The couple decided to leave immediately, but the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The whispers turned into screams, and they could feel unseen hands pushing and pulling them. They struggled to the front door, finally breaking free and running to their car. They sped down the road, the old house fading into the darkness behind them. The GPS recalculated and guided them back to the main highway. As they drove, Sarah noticed something in the rearview mirror. Emily's ghostly figure was sitting in the back seat, her expression one of sorrow. "Thank you for helping me," she whispered before fading away. Sarah and Mark eventually made it home, but the experience left them deeply shaken. They later learned that Old Willow Lane was infamous for ghost sightings and mysterious disappearances. They vowed never to take shortcuts again, especially on haunted roads. The diary they found was later donated to a local museum, where it remains a chilling reminder of their encounter with the supernatural. To this day, they can't shake the feeling that Emily's spirit is still out there, warning travelers to avoid the haunted path of Old Willow Lane.
The haunting road trip. The Thompson family was excited about their summer road trip. David and Sarah, along with their two children, Emma and Jake, had planned a scenic drive through the Appalachian Mountains to visit a remote cabin they had rented for the week. The trip was meant to be a bonding experience, a chance to disconnect from their busy lives and enjoy nature. As they drove deeper into the mountains, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the winding road. The thick forest on either side of the road grew denser, and an eerie silence settled over the area. David, who was driving, noticed the GPS signal was becoming weak. but he reassured his family that they were on the right track. "Look at that view," Sarah exclaimed, pointing to the majestic mountains in the distance. The kids were glued to their devices, barely looking up, but Emma glanced out the window and smiled. The road grew narrower and more winding as they progressed. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the air grew colder. Sarah shivered and turned up the heat. "It's getting kind of spooky out here," she said with a nervous laugh. As darkness fell, the atmosphere inside the car became tense. David squinted at the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I think we're almost there," he said, trying to sound confident. But in truth, he was starting to feel uneasy. They drove on for what seemed like hours, the forest around them becoming a dark, impenetrable wall. Suddenly, Emma let out a gasp. "Did you see that?" She whispered, pointing to the edge of the road. "What is it?" "Honey," Sarah asked, looking in the direction Emma was pointing. "I thought I saw someone standing there," Emma said, her voice trembling. David glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing. "Probably just a shadow," he said, trying to reassure her. But as they continued driving, strange things began to happen. The car's radio, which had been off, suddenly crackled to life, playing an old, scratchy tune. The GPS flickered, then went blank. "What the heck?" David muttered, tapping the screen. Sarah looked around nervously. "Maybe we should turn back," she suggested. "No, we're almost there." "I'm sure of it," David replied, though his voice betrayed his doubt. As they rounded a bend, they saw an old, weathered sign by the side of the road. "Welcome to Silent Hollow." The sight of it sent a chill down their spines. The road through Silent Hollow was even narrower and more overgrown. The trees seemed to press in on them, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness ahead. "Mom, I'm scared," Jake said, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, sweetie." "We're safe in the car," Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. As they drove on, they began to see figures on the side of the road. Shadowy, indistinct shapes that seemed to meld into the darkness as soon as the headlights touched them. David's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to focus on the road, but the figures were everywhere. "There! Did you see that?" Emma cried, pointing again. This time, they all saw it. A woman in a long, white dress standing by the side of the road, her face obscured by her hair. As they passed her, she turned her head slowly, her eyes glinting in the darkness. "Who was that?" Sarah whispered, clutching David's arm. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving," David said, his voice tight with fear. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. David tried to restart the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "Dad, what's happening?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know, buddy." "Just stay calm," David said, though he was anything but a calm. They sat in the dark, the silence pressing in around them. Then, from the shadows, they heard a sound. A soft, rustling noise, like leaves being blown by the wind. But there was no wind. The sound grew louder, closer. David fumbled for his flashlight, his hand shaking. He shone the beam into the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Then they saw her again, the woman in white, standing right in front of the car, her eyes fixed on them. She raised a hand and pointed at the car, her expression one of sorrow and anger. "David, do something," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. David tried the ignition one last time. Miraculously, the engine roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, the woman in white disappearing into the darkness behind them. They drove as fast as they could, the forest eventually giving way to open road. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a welcome sight. But the memory of Silent Hollow and the ghostly woman would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a chilling reminder of the terror they had encountered on that fateful road trip.
The Phantom of Route 13. Route 13, stretching through the rural heartlands of America, is infamous for its eerie legends and ghostly tales. Many travelers have reported strange occurrences along this stretch of road, and it has become a part of local folklore. Emily and Jack, a young couple returning from a vacation, were about to experience this firsthand. It was a crisp autumn evening, and Emily and Jack were driving home after spending a weekend at a cabin in the mountains. The sun had set, casting long shadows over the winding Route 13. The road was deserted, with no other cars in sight. They decided to take this route as a shortcut, despite hearing rumors about its haunted reputation. The drive was uneventful at first, but as they ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavier. The car radio began to crackle with static, and the GPS lost signal. The dense forest on either side of the road seemed to close in on them, the trees casting eerie shapes in the moonlight. About an hour into their drive, they saw a figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated by the car's headlights. It was a young woman in a white dress, her hair disheveled and her face pale. She raised her thumb, signaling for a ride. Against his better judgment, Jack slowed the car. Emily rolled down her window and asked, "Do you need help?" The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, can you take me to the nearest town? My car broke down." Emily and Jack exchanged glances but decided to help her. She climbed into the back seat, her presence immediately filling the car with an unnerving chill. She introduced herself as Claire and directed them to continue down Route 13. As they drove, Claire remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Emily tried to make small talk, but Claire's responses were curt and distant. After a few minutes, Jack looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that Claire was gone. The back seat was empty. Panicked, they pulled over and searched the area, but there was no trace of her. Shaken, they decided to keep driving, hoping to reach the nearest town quickly. Following the GPS's re-established signal, they took a detour that led them to an old, abandoned house. The structure looked decrepit, its windows boarded up and the yard overgrown. The GPS indicated that they needed to pass through the property to get back to the main road. Desperate and unnerved, they decided to explore the house, hoping to find someone who could help or give them directions. The interior was musty and filled with dust. Cobwebs adorned the corners, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. They split up to search for any signs of recent habitation. Emily found an old photograph on a dusty table. It was a picture of a family, with Claire standing among them. She looked much happier and more vibrant than the ghostly figure they had picked up. Underneath the photo was a newspaper clipping detailing a tragic car accident that had claimed Claire's life on Route 13 decades ago. As Emily read the newspaper, Jack called out from another room. He had found more photographs and letters, all pointing to the same tragic story. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and they could see their breath in the air. Whispers filled the house, growing louder and more frantic. The couple decided to leave immediately, but as they reached the front door, it slammed shut. The whispers turned into anguished screams, and they felt unseen hands pushing and pulling them. They struggled to break free and finally managed to push the door open, running to their car. They sped away from the house, the ghostly screams fading into the distance. The road seemed endless, but they eventually reached a small town. Exhausted and terrified, they checked into a motel and tried to piece together what had happened. The next day, they visited the local library to research the house and Route 13. They found numerous accounts of ghost sightings and unexplained accidents on that road. Claire's story was among the most famous, with many travelers reporting encounters with her spirit. Emily and Jack never took Route 13 again. The experience left them deeply shaken, a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. They often shared their story with friends and family, warning others about the haunted highway. To this day, they can't forget the ghostly hitchhiker they encountered and the eerie house they explored on that fateful night. Route 13 remains a legend, its dark history continuing to haunt those who dare to travel it.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of darkness. If you enjoyed this tale, please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more chilling stories of the unknown.